Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome once again to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that from time to time we try to bring for you different subjects, and under those very subjects we try to cater to your needs while studying the different topics. So we have selected a very good topic for you today, that is a democracy. Democracy is a term which many of you used a number of times, but what actually democracy is? For this we have again with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is an Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. So let's try to understand from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha what actually democracy means, as well as I would like to tell you all that we would be conducting two sessions, that is two lectures on this very topic, that is democracy. One is today and another would be tomorrow. So let's once again welcome our guest Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha, welcome to the EduSec lecture. As democracy is always called about for the people, of the people and by the people, but beyond this definition, what we have for our students who might be watching right now?
Thank you, Madam Geetika. In fact, today's discussion we are going to have on the concept of democracy, and it will be divided into two parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 2, I will be focusing mostly on the debates which are taking place on the issue of this entire conceptualization of democracy in recent times. But today I will basically bring into the discussion some of the issues which are quite central to any idea of a democracy or any understanding of democracy. That how do we how should we approach this question of democracy? Because in fact, when we talk of democracy, we imply with democracy two things. One, as rightly pointed out earlier, that it implies the rule of the people, that the sovereignty lies with the people. But who is this people? Then the question boils down to the majority, that the majority of people, whatever they feel, is basically a democracy. Then there has been a criticism of this idea also, that this majoritarian decision can also be mobocracy, that the rule of the mob, the majority. So how to regulate this decision making, in a sense that those who do not constitute majority, their voice, their opinion are also counted, if not basically made the determining factor, but nonetheless they are not totally ignored. So here it becomes a question of majority and minority, not in terms of identity groups, but in terms of the different shades of opinion, that some opinions will becomes majority opinion and there are opinions which are also become minority opinion. So that is one issue. But at the same time, we should also understand that democracy is both a kind of is a method to arrive at a collective decision, and therefore we often hear that democratic way of taking decision. If some decision is basically taken arbitrarily, then we criticize it that it is not done democratically. So I mean, it's a kind of method also of arriving at decisions, where attempt is made to evolve a consensus on different issues, and the consensus is normally not unanimity, but nonetheless consensus is a mechanism through which various sets of opinions are factored into the decision making process, and thereby a kind of understanding is developed. So I mean, this consensual decision at times is also referred as a democratic decision. So therefore, at times when we talk of democracy, we refer to this method of arriving at decisions, but at the same time democracy also implies a set of values, and those values which basically are important for arriving at decisions, the values which are important for governing people's life, and values which are important for the sustenance of the human society and human life. So the values are also integral to this idea, that democracy cannot be insulated, separated from certain core values, and those values are the values which have become the most cherished values of humanity or human beings in modern times. So therefore, democracy of course is an old concept, we will come to this issue later, that how it has evolved over the ages. In fact, there was a time when there were many ancient societies, community based societies, they were considered democratic in nature, in the sense that they believed in the people's participation, community participation in decision making, but nonetheless these core values which I am referring to, those values were not present there, and therefore at times when you talk of democracy in modern sense, then it becomes different from the way democracy was conceptualized and visualized earlier. So these values are very crucial, and there are 2-3 important values here. One is the value of equality, another is the value of liberty, and the third is the value of tolerance, or one can say the value of diversity, that how diversity becomes important for democracy, not homogeneity but heterogeneity, not one set of ideas, one set of identities, but multiple ideas and multiple identities can coexist, and thereby the entire decision about the governing the society which is inhabited by this diversity of identities and ideas is basically governed democratically, where no idea, no opinion, no viewpoint is basically should feel that it is being ignored. So that is also important. So diversity and tolerance along with liberty and equality, and along with all these values, the concept of fraternity. So I mean all these values are very crucial for the working of a democratic society or a democratic government. So that is one thing. At times we refer to both democratic society and democratic government. I mean there is a difference. The government, when we talk of government, then basically we refer to the organization of power, or agencies through the organized power is wielded and exercised, and how democratically it is basically handled, or how democratically it can operate. And here it becomes important that how this agency of agency through this collective power is exercised is based on the consent of the people. So consent here becomes important, and it is through this consent that a legitimacy is provided to this power structure. So legitimacy based on consent, and therefore the entire idea of accountability also emerges out of this when we talk of democracy at the level of government and state. But when we talk of democracy at the level of society, then we basically mean that how society is basically surviving, how the society is basically working, functioning through democratic means. And when we talk of democratic means, then basically 2-3 things are important, and one is here tolerance, that how people are tolerant towards each other, how the entire concept of coexistence is basically premised on this idea of tolerance, tolerant towards different culture, different viewpoints, different faith, different identities, and so on and so forth. So therefore this distinction is also important: democratic state, democratic government, and democratic society. Now what happens that when we talk of democracy, then of course 2-3 important issues emerge here, and that is that how it has been conceptualized. The conceptualization part is important, because it is on the issue of conceptualization that there has been a lot of debate, and there is also division among the scholars, and this division is very important in the entire social science. Then another issue comes that how people have defended democracy, because as we know that democracy has been both defended as well as criticized. There are defenders of democracy, because those who defend it, they believe that there is nothing better than this government, because of 2-3 things. Number one, that it is based on the consent of the people, it is best for securing liberty and rights of the people. It is the best government which can basically help people developing their self, their identity, their protection of their common interest, and so on and so forth. So therefore the defense of democracy is basically essentially premised on basis of its role in promoting human welfare. So, I mean this defense is there, and at the same time we also find that there have been critiques also. There are a lot of critiques of democracy. They believe that this is not a very good form of government because of 2-3 reasons, that here the decisions are not quick because it believes in a principle that all decisions should be based on the consent of the people, and the consent of the people is not at times readily available. Number 2, it believes in the consent of the people, and therefore the people, all of them are not quite intelligent and profound in terms of their opinion, and therefore it is a government which is based on mediocrity. It does not recognize the basically talent of the people. It is not based on the principle that better ideas, those who are better qualified, they should be in a position to provide the leadership. Rather, it believes that it is ultimately the majority of the people who should count. So, therefore, the critics of democracy are equally sizable in number, and these critiques have taken number of forms, and as we know that there are number of political theorists who have criticized even in modern times. In fact, the entire idea of totalitarianism or authoritarianism, the two systems, political systems which have come off and on in modern times, they have basically come on this basis of criticism of this democratic form of government as a popular government based on popular sovereignty and the consent of the people. So, the criticism part. So, what happens that conceptualization, then the defense, and then criticism. So, basically when we basically survey the entire ideas, or if we run our eyes on the whole set of ideas on this concept of democracy, we find that they are essentially divided into 2-3 categories: those who have defended it, those who have critiqued it. But at the same time, the conceptualization part is very important. We will come to this issue later. Now, then the third thing is the models, different models of democracy, and that is also important, that how democracy has been visualized as a system of government, basically in which this participation of the people is important, but the participation, the nature of participation has always been debated, that at what level people should participate and what type of participation can qualify a particular system, organization or arrangement to be democratic. So, the nature of participation, and this participation of course has been very important for a model of democracy which is considered direct democracy or participatory democracy. I will come to this issue later, that this participatory or the direct democracy was basically the hallmark of the ancient societies, where whatever form the democracy was available, it was essentially based on this participatory model, whether it was Athens in the ancient Greek society, or even in ancient Indian society, when we had the concept of this panchayat, samitis, sabhas, and we believe that in ancient times lot of small village communities, they govern their lives through number of assemblies, and those assemblies working was more or less democratic in terms of the decision making and the participation of the people, where every member participated. Of course, here we should also remember that at times it is believed that in ancient times this principle of direct democracy, this model of direct democracy was also based on the principle of exclusion. A lot of people were excluded. For example, in ancient Athens, it is believed that the slaves, women, and other types of members of the society, they were excluded from both decision making and those assemblies which was based on mass participation, because they are considered inferior. So, inferiority and superiority basically characterize the participation, and here as the Aristotle, perhaps the Greek philosopher, political thinker, is most notable, who even said that the thinking and sweating cannot go together. So, basically those who are involved in a work which basically leads to sweating, they are not entitled for doing a work which is based on essentially a work which basically is geared towards thinking. So, I mean this type of thing was there, and even on democracy we find that these Greek thinkers had strong reservations. For example, Aristotle himself, he considered polity to be better than democracy, because democracy was considered to be based on the majority rule, and majority was considered not very intelligent, wise and profound in terms of their application of their mind. So, I mean this thing was there. Even in India we believe that ancient times number of hierarchies characterize the social order. In fact, the most important hierarchy was the hierarchy of caste, and therefore, in the caste hierarchy everyone did not occupy the similar status. Even on terms of gender equality, we believe that women did not have the similar rights as men. So, I mean one thing is important, that this entire direct or participatory democracy in ancient time was based on the principle of exclusion and inequality, whereas equality is a very important value for modern democracy, whether participatory or the representative. Of course, today we have very few cases of participatory democracy the way it was prevalent in ancient times, but at the level of idea it exists even today. For example, many of us can recall that the Switzerland basically practices some sort of direct democracy through number of instruments, and the three instruments are very important: referendum, recall and initiative. But it is not comparable to what was the situation in ancient time, and therefore, the conditions for the working of a particular model of democracy is important, and why we have moved from the direct to indirect democracy is also quite important here. We will come to this issue, that why today that ancient model of direct democracy is not feasible and workable, and why this representative democracy is basically the most suitable mechanism so far as working of the democracy concerned in modern times. So, therefore, the another model, that is the representative or indirect democracy, is considered to be a modern phenomenon, and it is basically also at times equated with the liberal democracy, because as we will discuss later, that how liberalism has emerged as an ideology, as a way of life, as a worldview in modern times, and how that worldview has been accompanied with number of practices, and one of the important political practice has been this representative or indirect democracy. So, I mean therefore, if we associate the direct democracy or the participatory democracy with the ancient, then we normally associate the representative or the indirect democracy with the modern. And of course, even in this representative indirect democracy, there are a lot of internal differentiations, there are a lot of issues of debate, there is no unanimity on number of issues. So, that debate characterizes, in fact that debate characterizes the high point of this modern representative model of democracy, and the issues are still unresolved. The debate is still in process of basically shaping up. Lot of issues are entering into this entire discourse, and that is of course enriching the entire practice of democracy as well as the idea of democracy. So, theory and practice of democracy in modern times has basically been enriched by number of issues which have come basically in course of the working of the modern institutions and modern political process. So, we will come to this issue, that is modern thing later. So, I mean this one classification, that is basically the direct and the indirect. Then there is another classification, that is basically the classification of liberal and the Marxist or the socialist model. In fact, the liberal model of democracy is believed to be based on certain institutional practices and certain institutional arrangements, on certain values, where basically the political freedom is basically privileged, where political equality is also considered important, where certain set of rights are considered important. But one thing important, the economic rights are not privileged in the same way as the political rights are basically accorded a higher status. Whereas in this radical, the Marxist, or even not Marxist but the socialist tradition, because socialism has a number of schools, and within that tradition, in fact what happens, that there are certain values which are considered important, but one of the most important value is the value of economic equality or economic justice. and therefore, they believe that unless there is basically end of inequality, disparities, unless there is a equality both social and political, this idea of democracy cannot be basically actualized. So, basically entire concept of social democracy becomes integral to this idea of political democracy. So, therefore, this another differentiation, that is this radical Marxist or the socialist versus the liberal one. Then of course, you have the associational notion of democracy, you have deliberative notion of democracy, then you have the procedural and substantive distinction in the entire conceptualization of democracy, and finally, you have also this elitist and the pluralist distinction, that whether the democracy is the rule of the elites and the people, the general common masses are only the consumers, and basically the elites are basically supposed to rule, they are supposed to lead, and the people are only supposed to go and vote for them. So, iron law of oligarchy, I mean only a set of people will always rule, and the circulation of elites, if it is there, then one can say that it is basically a democratic form of government. Whereas, there is also a pluralist point of view, that how different groups, different communities, different associations in society should share power. So, I mean all these models, all these distinctions are there about so far as this model of democracy is concerned. But the two important models which are very important for any discussion is the model of direct and participatory democracy and indirect or representative democracy, which is at times equated with the liberal democracy. So, we will basically focus on these two models. But one thing is important, that is the question of legitimacy in democracy, that any decision which is not legitimate and therefore, it cannot be called a democratic decision. So, what is this idea of legitimacy? And as I mentioned at the very outset, that this idea of legitimacy emerges from the idea of consent, that anything which is not based on the consent of the people is not democratic. But ultimately, then question becomes that who is to give this consent, the entire society or only half of the society, or basically only the adult people, or only the educated people, or only the rich people. And this has also been responsible for a lot of debates within this entire discourse on democracy, that ultimately this democracy constitutes, or the democratic society, or the constituency of this entire process is located where? Who constitutes the people? And as we know, this thing has also evolved gradually. There was a time when the propertyless did not have any say in this consent giving process. There was a time when those who were not educated people in society, they did not have any right to be part of this process. Women did not have the right to right in this process. In India, there were many sections of the society who were excluded from this caste hierarchy. They did not have any right to participate in this process, and therefore, this idea of universal adult franchise has been a revolutionary idea so far as this question of political equality is concerned. And it is here that India can take a basically ethical moral edge so far as this evolution of democracy is concerned, because India is perhaps one of the rare instances where what happens that after the constitution was enacted, it basically in one stroke gave this right to vote to everyone, every Indian, is irrespective of caste, community, identity and other markers, and that became the universal adult franchise. So, India started its democratic journey with universal adult franchise, whereas in West what happened that it was given in bits and pieces, in doses. Women, entire movement for the suffrage, women's suffrage took many years to win this right, and therefore, it came much later. The blacks did not have this right in United States of America, a country which is known for basically revolutionizing this concept of democracy in modern times. So, I mean India that way took a lead by basically giving this universal adult franchise to the Indian people, the citizens of India. So therefore, this thing has also been evolving. Even this concept of limited franchise, giving right to vote to only those who are taxpayers, who have some ownership of land, the wealthy people, the literate people, that was also gradually eliminated in India. During colonial period, as we all of us know, that India democratic process came into existence during the colonial period itself. Of course, initially at the local level, at the local self government level, the municipalities, the district boards, and this is how we remember Lord Ripon and Mayo, the two important British functionaries who basically introduced this system at the local level, at the lower level. Now, what happened that this local level democracy gradually graduated to the higher level, but nonetheless one important characteristic of that system at that time was limited franchise. The franchise was based essentially on the criterion of education, wealth, so on and so forth. So therefore, this is not only confined to India, but this was spread in different parts of the world. Even in those countries where it is believed that in modern times this democratic revolutions took place, new ideas emerged, new institutions were shaped, and that basically helped gradually to make this idea more effective and forceful. For example, you have United States of America, you have France, and you have the Britain. So three important zones, or one can say the three important societies which witness new churning, which witness revolutionary ideas in modern times. French Revolution, American War of Independence, and number of important movements and revolutions in England. So I mean, this way we have seen that it has, even in modern times, it has not come with a one stroke. It has been won over the ages. Even today, this thing is evolving. New rights are being fought for. New rights are being won day after day, and therefore with new rights, with new types of rights, people gaining a new vision for democracy. So therefore today we are talking of animals' rights, we are talking of the rights of the lesbians and the gays, we are talking about different types of equality, and what is happening that is also leading to the deepening of democracy. So deepening of democracy is another important thing. One is how horizontally or basically how you widens this net of democracy. Another is that not only widening the net of democracy, but how you deepen it, and this is exactly what normally is implied by substantive democracy, that it is not only the procedures, institutionally there should be a mechanism to factor in the consent of the people, but there should also be a mechanism in place to basically deepen it, by deepening that you can the new meanings should be attached, or more meaningful involvement, engagement of the people should be there. It should not be empty, hollow action of just voting at regular interval, but it should be more meaningful in terms of people's engagement with political power. So this substantive and the procedural distinction is also important, where liberty is basically tied with equality, and this is how it is believed that the democracy can be actualized. So I mean, this substantive and procedural, what I mentioned earlier, is also important, this thing. But this entire concept of democracy, there are 4 or 5 issues which emerge in such a way that forces one to think about different ways and means through which those issues can be addressed, and that leads to basically the conceptualization of democracy and conceptualization of the institutional mechanisms, the processes through which democracy can be made effective and useful. First, who should rule? This question emerges when we talk of democracy, that in democracy who should rule, otherwise also in a society who should rule. But if a society is believing in the principle of democracy, then the question emerges that who should rule. Then the next question which confronts us is that what should be the principle of government formation, that who should form the government. And then the third question emerges along with these two is the institutional arrangement required for this government to basically function and work. So these 3 issues, that who should rule, Number 2, that what should be the principle of government formation. Number 3, that if government is formed, then what should be the institutional arrangements for this government. And then if it is the rule of the people, then the question also emerges that who are these people, and how do they rule, on what matters they rule, on what issues their consent is required. All these issues, when we confront and when we basically deal with this concept, we have to confront these questions, and the moment we confront these questions, then a new churning starts. And because of this confrontation with these questions over the ages, what has happened, the way people have addressed these questions have led to new conceptualizations, or basically conceptualizations which have led to new framework through which this entire idea of democracy has been basically operationalized, and the way the democracy has been visualized. Now, so basically what happens, that these questions are addressed in course of our engagement with this concept. But at the same time, the second important thing becomes that there are certain crucial, the key issues which one cannot ignore in any discussion of democracy. And the most important and the first important issue is the issue of popular power. That democracy, if it is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, as all of us remember from our childhood, Abraham Lincoln said, and number of definitions we are basically aware of, Pericles' famous speech, and so on and so forth. But then the question emerges that if power should lie with the people, then what happened, that these people, how they should exercise this power. And this leads to this major differentiation, as I was mentioning earlier, that people themselves should rule, that is the direct democracy, or people should rule by nominating or by creating a basically a medium or mechanism or intermediaries who are known as representatives. So that becomes a representative democracy. Then what kind of relationship should exist between the representatives and the people, if it is not a direct rule by the people? So this is a very complicated question, that what type of relationship is there, and this entire thing has led to a very interesting debate on the question of political representation, that whether the representatives are only the delegates or they are the trustee. Delegates means that they are only the representatives of the people, the way a delegate is sent to attend a meeting, that on certain issues they are delegated, authorized to represent those who have selected them. But apart from that, excluding those issues on which they have been basically sent as a delegate, or the power has been delegated, they do not possess any right to decide in their own wisdom. So they have to revert back to those who have sent them as a delegate. On the other hand, there are also viewpoints who believe that representatives are trustees, like a trustee, that once you choose them as your representative, they act as a trustee, as a custodian of your interest. In their own wisdom, in their judgment, they can decide that what is best in your interest. So they become your trustee. They enjoy your trust, but then that trust can also entitle them or empower them or basically enable them to take decisions autonomously, not like a delegate. So this issue is also very important. So therefore, what happens, that one thing one should remember, that entire thing is based on the principle of popular power, that is called popular sovereignty. We will come to this issue later when we will discuss Rousseau. And then the question of legitimacy and consent, that it is based on the consent, and therefore the legitimacy comes from the consent, and the accountability, that accountable. And there are number of mechanisms to make them accountable, but nonetheless representatives and represented, the relationship between the people and their representative in democracy is basically informed by these 3-4 important concepts. Now, the next issue which is basically confronted, or which people normally find in course of this engagement with this this idea, is that whose consent, how this consent is given. Now, that becomes a question of participation, that what should be the ideal way of giving this consent. In direct election, I mean in direct democracy, you have seen that the best way to give this consent is through election and the ballot paper and the ballot boxes. That through elections, what happens, that the people get the opportunity to decide that what are their issues, what are their concerns, and how those concerns have to be articulated, how those concerns have to be taken to the higher level of political sphere, and therefore they need some representatives, and representatives are elected, and then after 5 years or 4 years, whatever time for that legislature is there, they can legislate on their behalf, but then again they have to come for renewal of their consent and their basically legitimacy, and while renewing it, the people get the opportunity to audit their performance, that whether they have performed as per the mandate or as per the brief, or they have basically simply overstepped it, or have not discharged their function properly, and therefore they can vote them out. So, this is one way of how consent is given, that is participation, nature of participation. Now, what happened, that we have seen that this is in modern times, indirect representative democracy, but in ancient times, as we see, that entire the notion of participation, nature of participation was different. The entire society was participating, entire community was, because society was essentially community based life. So, entire community was participating. But what happens, that in modern times that type of participation was not possible, and therefore, this entire question of representatives and the mechanisms of participation, devising new mechanisms of participation, that representing, that your presence is basically is ensured not by your physical presence, but presence of your ideas which you have delegated or you have transferred to someone else. So, but there have been modern thinkers, there are many modern thinkers, and most important of among them was Rousseau, who questioned this way of participation, and therefore he said that sovereignty cannot be delegated, and he talked of popular sovereignty. The entire concept of general will was meant for this, that self cannot be transferred or delegated, will cannot be transferred and delegated, and therefore this entire notion of representation according to Rousseau was not sustainable, and he basically adored participatory democracy of Athenian or the ancient Roman period, that civic republicanism, the idea of civic life, the civic virtues, and the participation, the two cherished ideals of the ancient times, were basically resurrected by modern thinker Rousseau, a social contractualist, but he differed significantly from other two contractualist thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, because while they, to some extent one can say, that argued in direction of the evolution of this representative indirect democracy, Rousseau was someone who idealized and glamorized this ancient participatory model of democracy by taking a firm position that will cannot be delegated, will cannot be transferred. Popular sovereignty will rule, and popular sovereignty is nothing but general will, and general will is not the combination of different will, but a general will implies when personal interest is superseded by the public interest, the public good, and therefore that type of will of the people, when they are thinking not about themselves, but they are thinking about the larger interest, that type of will he used to call general will, and only that general will is entitled or empowered to rule. So, this was his entire vision of a democratic society, the participatory democratic society. But nonetheless, the majority of thinkers in modern times, they believed in the representative model of democracy. Now, what happens that along with this issue of popular power, there are 2-3 other important issues which have become very important in this conceptualization of democracy over the years. And one issue is the political equality. And this political equality, as I was mentioning earlier, was totally absent in the ancient time, particularly in this participatory direct democracy. Because as I mentioned that even in ancient Athens, which basically celebrated this direct participatory democracy, number of people in society were excluded from the purview of this democratic decision making. Slaves, women, illiterate people, lesser wise members of the society, all of them did not possess any right to participate. And therefore, in modern times, equality, liberty and justice, 3 important values along with fraternity, which have characterized the dawn of the modern era. Now, what has happened that this political equality has been the hallmark of this modern conceptualization of democracy. And it is on this issue that one can say that a person like Rousseau, a thinker like Rousseau, who on certain issues can join ranks of the ancient thinkers so far as this participatory democracy is concerned, but nonetheless on this issue of equality even he will have to break the ranks, because Rousseau also believed in the notion of equality. And therefore, when he talked of natural and social inequality, when he critiqued civil society, when he tried to create a genuine society, when he was looking for a contract through which a democratic society could be created, he was basically hinting at this type of inequitable or inequitable distribution of resources. So, I mean this way this political equality and social and economic equality are the modern phenomenon. But nonetheless, one thing we should remember that this political equality is perhaps most important feature or value of liberal democracy, and it is here that there is some difference between the liberal and the radical or the Marxist conceptualization of democracy. Because what happens that the radical and the Marxist tradition, they also considered along with political equality, what is important is the social and economic inequality, economic equality. So, therefore, this entire concept of social democracy comes into the picture, that unless there is a proper way to redistribute resources, unless there is a equality in economic sphere, so political equality will become meaningless. Here in fact, I would like to mention the Indian debate on democracy, and in the Constituent Assembly when India was trying to frame a constitution for itself, and when the draft constitution was ready, and the chairman of the drafting committee Ambedkar, he made his last speech on the floor of the assembly when he was piloting that bill. He made a very prophetic statement. He said that today we are going to enter a life of contradiction. In politics we will have total equality, because every man and every woman will have one vote to cast. But in social sphere, what would characterize India will be social inequality and economic inequality. And then he mentioned that unless we remove this contradiction, that equality in politics but inequality in society, I think this entire structure edifice which we have created here may not last long. Particularly those who would suffer on account of this inequality may come forward and blow the entire structure. So, what he was hinting at, that there has to be a social equality, economic equality and political equality, then only the democratic foundation of a democratic society and democratic government can be made powerful and strong. So, I mean this was something which was stated by Ambedkar. But what I am trying to argue, that these radical socialist traditions, they basically part company with this liberal tradition on this very issue, that they consider political equality important, but they also consider social and economic equality equally important for the sustenance of this idea. But so far the political equality is concerned, the liberal conceptualization of democracy is essentially premised on this, and they believe that this is perhaps the most important achievement of human beings, that all decisions are to be taken by them, the people's power, because the sovereignty lies with them. And then who is the people? Then there will be no discrimination that who should take and who shouldn't take, who should be part of this process or not. Everyone will be equally entitled, and therefore there will be political equality. All citizens will have this right to take decisions or to be party to these decisions. But as we have seen that how this has evolved gradually, earlier only propertied people had this right to be part of this process, only the male members of society had this right to participate, only the privileged ones had the right to participate, but gradually that exclusiveness of participation ended, and gradually the ambit of participation was widened, and therefore basically this one man, one vote, one woman, one vote concept increased, and this universal suffrage, universal adult franchise became the buzzword of modern democracy. So basically this entire question of political equality is based on the principle of equal moral worth of individual. Therefore, what is basically implied by this, that there shouldn't be any hierarchy, there shouldn't be any privileges, there shouldn't be any discrimination in society. Now, all adult members of society should be part of this political process. Now, what happened that this concept of political equality therefore has been considered very important, and any society which basically suffers from this equality, normally it is believed that it cannot be qualified as a political democracy or a government or a system which can boast of its democratic credentials. Because at times we hear that even some military dictators introduce to a mechanism to legitimize their rule, and they call it democracy. But basically whether it is democracy or not, that thing is tested and judged on basis of certain principles, and those principles are essentially the principles like rights, whether the rights are guaranteed in the constitution, whether the mechanism to basically protect those rights is in place or not, whether people are enjoying liberty and equality or not. So therefore certain values are crucial. I mean, the democracy as a system of government, as a system of seeking consent of the people, a system of generating legitimacy of the people, because it is not that simply people are going to vote and one can say that this is a democratic government. So we have seen that sometimes the dictatorial regime also comes into picture when they go for an election to create legitimacy for its rule, and then they give the right to the people to vote, and they basically consider this voting as a mechanism of legitimacy, and then they start flaunting that legitimacy to say that this is not a dictatorial or a military rule, it is a democratic rule, because people have given the consent to rule, and they have secured, and the ruler has secured the consent of the people for its rule. But what happens that when we test it through certain other values and other principles, we find that it is found totally lacking on those values. And those values, as I mentioned, that whether the rights are there or not, whether constitution is there or not, whether there is a mechanism or institution to protect those rights are there or not, whether there is a political equality, or one can say that whether the participation is based on the principle of totally non-exclusive characteristics. These values, when they are basically brought into the discussion, then it is proved that the entire legitimacy which was created was a manufactured legitimacy, and therefore it cannot qualify as a democratic regime or a democratic government. So therefore political equality is very important, along with certain other set of values which should characterize a democratic government or a democratic process of arriving at decisions. As I mentioned, that it is both a method as well as a set of values. But along with this political equality, there are other values also, and one of the most important value in modern times is the value of diversity. That whether the diversity, I mean this heterogeneity of ideas, opinions, identities, viewpoints, whether that is respected or not. If that is not respected, if an attempt is made to homogenize the society, if attempt is made to basically flatten or differences in opinion, then it is believed that it is not a democratic way of arriving at decisions, or it is not a democratic way of governing a society. So diversity and tolerance are two another important values which should accompany a democratic government. For example, there are many societies which are diverse, and therefore there was a time when it was believed that democracy is not a system which can function properly in those societies which are characterized by diversity and plurality. For example, people were skeptical even about India when India started its journey, democratic journey, because it was believed that India is society where you have number of languages, number of different religions, different types of social customs, practices, and therefore this diversity will be inimical to the health of democracy, because democracy can succeed only in a society where the people have a commonality of identities and interests, like some societies of Europe, because the most important commonality was the language and to some extent religion. But in India it was believed that because it is a heterogeneous society, so this diversity would not enable democracy to function. But the way Indian democracy has functioned, it is a kind of lesson for the entire world. And basically now, with the rise of a new school of thought, a new thinking, that is called multiculturalism, that how to celebrate multiple ideas and multiple cultures. And this multiculturalism essentially is based on this principle that different culture, different viewpoint, different types of diversities are a kind of asset, because that enriches experiences. And basically any system which is based on different types of experiences, it also becomes very useful in managing different types of challenges. So diversity therefore, instead of being a liability for democracy, it is today believed that democracy is the diversity is one of the important characteristic of democracy in modern times. Without diversity, without democracy's engagement with diversity, it cannot basically succeed, or it cannot survive. Now what happens that along with this diversity comes another concept, that is tolerance, and it is this tolerance which is at times associated with secularism, what normally we believe. Secularism is not something which is purely associated with religion, that there should be separation between religion and politics, between religion and state, but secularism essentially implies tolerance. Therefore at times we hear that India is one society which has had secular fabric from the very beginning, because India had a tradition of tolerance toward different ideas, different identities, different viewpoints. And democracy, which is basically based on the people's power, people's participation, and where such a large number of people will basically interact, engage with each other, and they will try to arrive at a decision. Here the tolerance towards each other viewpoint is very important. Whether you agree or disagree, that is a different question, but remaining tolerant toward others is a very important feature of such society. So tolerance and diversity along with tolerance are considered important, but along with this, what is also considered to be crucial for the success, or basically for the successful working of democracy, is the political freedom. And political freedom is basically associated with the freedom of expression, freedom to form associations, freedom to start any movement, freedom these days is also considered in terms of access to the information. This is what now is available in India, right to information, that if people are better informed, if people have access to different types of informations about the political system, about the political power, about different issues, then the people can take a more informed decision, more wise decision, more effective and more profound decision about their life, their society, and so on and so forth. So therefore this political freedom, which implies all these issues which I have just mentioned, are also considered equally important value, along with the value of rights, that all these things are insignificant unless they are accompanied with a set of rights, and rights are basically nothing but the needs of the people, and how people's needs are accorded a status or a kind of a stature in the public discourse, where you have a constitutional or legal sanctity of those things, then only the rights become a more meaningful recognition of human needs. So rights, freedom, diversity, political equality, these are important values through which this democratic the discourse moves. It is not simply the process of casting vote. In fact, that is an important way of choosing representative, as I was discussing earlier. But then, as I mentioned, that sometimes some people who may not have a very good democratic credentials, they may come with the use of those voting mechanism to legitimize their rule. But whether it is democratic government or democratic rule or not, that can be judged only with the help of these values. Now, with these important values, the important issue which comes into the discussion is the question of majority rule or the minority rule. That ultimately democracy is believed that it is the rule of the majority. But then what will happen to the minorities? It is not majority and minority in terms of identity groups in society, but majority opinion and minority opinion. That if there are 100 people sitting together and 98 people are for a particular type of decision and the 2 people are dissenting, then whether the 2 people are totally insignificant for this decision or their decisions or their viewpoints also matter. So, this has been the most important issue of debate both earlier and today, that how this democracy can be made a system where minority interests are equally protected, minority opinions are equally protected. And one of the most important or one of the very important political thinker of modern times, John Stuart Mill, engaged with this issue, which I will take up in the next lecture when we will basically discuss some of the issues of issues in debate in modern times. But what I would like to mention here today, that this entire question of the evolution of democracy, the way it has evolved from ancient to modern, from direct participative to representative, and then the way the different values have evolved, liberty, equality, justice, diversity, as I have just mentioned, have led to a number of churnings. And one of the most important debate which we witness today is on the issue of 2-3 issues: the participation and this accountability and representation, that how democratic system is more accountable, responsive to the needs of the people. And then along with that, we are also witnessing a number of debates today emerging within democracy along issues like that what is the relationship between modernity and democracy, what is the relationship between capitalism, the market, and democracy, what is the relationship between nation and democracy. All these issues will basically take up the debates on democracy in our next lecture.
Definitely, sir. We would be talking more on the democracy in our next lecture. That would be tomorrow. With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for delivering such a nice lecture and giving our students the most productive session. Dear friends, if you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, you can mail us at info.cec@nec.in. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much once again.